What would you do if someone showed up at your doorstep, demanding control over something that was never theirs to begin with? The tires screeched against the gravel, an unwelcome intrusion into the quiet evening air. My fingers tightened around the edge of my mug as I looked out the window, heart rate picking up. A sleek black SUV was rolling up my long driveway, kicking up dust as it came to an abrupt stop near the front of my cabin. No one ever came out here, not unless they were lost or had a damn good reason. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I had chosen this place for its isolation. The last thing I wanted was a stranger disturbing the peace I had built. I stood up, setting my mug down with a quiet clink, and made my way to the porch. The crisp air bit at my skin as I pushed the door open, stepping outside just as the SUV's engine cut off. A tense silence followed, stretching out for an uncomfortable beat before the door swung open. The woman who stepped out was a jarring contrast to the rugged landscape around us. High heels clicked against the stone path as she adjusted the cuffs of a perfectly pressed blazer, her sharp, appraising gaze sweeping over my property with a look that made my stomach tighten. It wasn't curiosity. It was judgment. She was scrutinizing everything, the worn wood of my cabin, the split logs stacked neatly by the side, the lake shimmering beyond the trees, as if she were inspecting something that didn't meet her standards. I didn't move. I just watched, waiting. Her expression remained stiff as she walked toward me with the rigid posture of someone who expected people to move out of her way. Finally, she stopped at the base of my porch steps, looking up at me with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clipped and authoritative. "Are you the owner of this property?" The way she said it made it sound like she already had an opinion about me, about whether or not I belonged here. "Yeah," I said evenly, crossing my arms. "Can I help you?" She hesitated, her gaze shifting around again before she drew in a breath, as if preparing for a speech. "I'm Karen," she announced, as if the name alone should mean something to me. "President of the Homeowners Association for this area." I frowned. The HOA? That didn't make any sense. My cabin wasn't part of any HOA. It was on private land, well beyond the reach of any suburban development. Karen must have seen the confusion on my face, because she quickly pressed on. "I'm here about the noise," she said, her tone taking on a pointed sharpness. "Your property is disturbing the vacation experience for other residents around the lake. It's too disruptive." I blinked. "Noise?" "Yes," she said curtly. "We've had multiple complaints. Your activities here are affecting the tranquility of the community." I stared at her, waiting for her to clarify. "What activities?" The only sounds out here were the rustling of leaves, the occasional call of a loon from the lake, and the steady hum of the wind moving through the trees. Karen's expression hardened, as though she had already made up her mind about me. She wasn't here to listen. She was here to dictate. And I wasn't about to let her. The next few days passed in uneasy silence, but the tension never left. I found myself checking the driveway more often than I liked, expecting Karen's black SUV to appear again like a storm rolling in on the horizon. I told myself it was over, that she'd gotten her satisfaction by making her little speech and trying to assert control over something that wasn't hers. But deep down, I knew better. It started 2 nights later. I was sitting on my porch, listening to the quiet lull of the lake, when I caught the flicker of headlights through the trees. A moment later, the sharp red and blue strobe of police lights slashed across my cabin walls. My stomach tightened. I stood as a sheriff's deputy stepped out of his patrol car, a clipboard in hand. His expression was unreadable as he approached, boots crunching on gravel. "Evening," he said, his voice neutral. "We got a call about a noise complaint. Multiple reports of disturbances coming from this property." I frowned. "There's been no noise here," I said. "It's just me. No parties, no music, nothing." The officer glanced around. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant hoot of an owl. It was absurd, and he seemed to know it. "Mind if I take a look around?" he asked. I stepped aside, letting him inspect the area. After a few minutes, he returned, shaking his head. "Not seeing anything that warrants a complaint. But I do have to file a report. If this keeps happening, it could turn into an official investigation." That was the real problem. Karen didn't need actual proof, just persistence. She was weaponizing the system against me, using the HOA's influence to make my life miserable. The moment the deputy left, I spotted movement near the road. A silhouette, arms crossed, standing just outside the reach of my porch light. Karen. I didn't need to see her face to know she was smiling. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to turn away. She wanted a reaction. I wasn't going to give her one. But that didn't mean I was done. The next morning, I decided to install security cameras around the property. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was going to be ready. It didn't take long for the cameras to catch something. A few nights later, I sat at my desk, scrolling through the footage. My pulse spiked as I saw her, sneaking along the edge of my property, a garbage bag in hand. I watched as she crouched near the tree line, pulling out empty beer cans, fast food wrappers, and crumpled paper before scattering them near my driveway. I exhaled slowly, rage curling in my gut. The next morning, I found exactly what I expected, garbage strewn across my land. And as if on cue, an official-looking letter from the county arrived that afternoon. A violation notice for improper waste disposal. I didn't even open it. Instead, I made a copy of the footage and drove straight to the county office. When I presented the evidence, the clerk frowned, flipping through their records. "That's odd," she said. "The HOA doesn't actually have any jurisdiction over your property. These complaints shouldn't have even made it to our office." Exactly what I thought. "So what happens now?" I asked. The clerk hesitated. "We can remove this citation, but unless she's caught in the act again, we can't formally charge her with anything." Karen knew exactly how far she could push the rules. She didn't need to win legally, she just needed to make my life difficult. I left the county office more determined than ever. But Karen wasn't finished. The next week, a real estate agent showed up at my cabin. A middle-aged man in a pressed suit, standing on my porch like he had an appointment. "Mr. Walker?" he asked. "That's me," I said warily. He smiled in that polished, professional way that felt completely out of place. "I was informed that you might be interested in selling your property. I have a very motivated buyer who'd be willing to make a generous offer." I blinked. "I'm not selling." His smile tightened. "Are you sure? There's been talk that you were considering moving." I narrowed my eyes. "Talk from who?" The hesitation was brief, but it was there. "Well, the homeowners association mentioned you might be open to selling. I understand there have been difficulties with community regulations, and my client is prepared to take on any necessary improvements." That's when it clicked. Karen wasn't just trying to push me out, ***, she wanted my land, ***. I folded my arms. "Tell your client the land isn't for sale. And next time, ask me before assuming anything." The agent cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Understood. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." He walked back to his car, but I could already see the next move coming. Karen had tried intimidation. She had tried the law. Now, she was spreading false rumors to create pressure. And she was just getting started. It wasn't long before I felt the shift. The polite nods from my neighbors turned into wary glances, and the friendly waves I'd come to expect from the few other cabin owners around the lake disappeared altogether. People who had once been neutral, who had even sympathized with me, were suddenly keeping their distance. It didn't take much to figure out why. Karen wasn't just working behind the scenes, she was actively poisoning the well. The confirmation came when I ran into Marie Thompson, one of the few people I still trusted in the area. She had lived by the lake for years, long enough to see Karen's tactics play out before. When I asked her if something was going on, she sighed and motioned for me to follow her to her dock, away from prying ears. "You've got a real problem on your hands," she said, arms crossed as she looked out at the water. "Karen's been making the rounds, talking to every property owner she can get a hold of. She's telling them you're planning to turn your land into a rental business. That you're bringing in tourists. Strangers." I stiffened. "That's ridiculous. I've never even had a guest out here." Marie gave me a grim look. "That doesn't matter. She's got people spooked. You know how this place is, people moved out here for the quiet, for the exclusivity. The moment Karen tells them you're a threat to that, they start listening." A slow, simmering anger built in my chest. "And they just believe her?" Marie exhaled, rubbing her temples. "Some do. Some don't. But the ones who do are the loudest. You know how Karen operates, she isolates, she manipulates, and she makes damn sure people feel like they have to take her side. And now she's got them thinking that the only way to keep this lake the way it is to get rid of you." The weight of it settled in my gut. Karen wasn't just trying to make my life difficult, she was trying to turn the entire community against me. That night, I received my next warning shot. A thick envelope was taped to my front door, bearing the official-looking seal of the HOA. I knew better than to expect anything good. Inside, I found a list of fines, absurd violations claiming that I had failed to maintain community standards and was in breach of HOA guidelines. It would have been funny if it wasn't so blatantly illegal. My property wasn't part of the HOA. None of their rules applied to me. And yet, here was an itemized list, demanding thousands of dollars in fees for things like unauthorized modifications and landscaping violations. I stared at the paper, rage crawling up my spine. The next morning, I got a call from my lawyer, Jonathan Blake, who had been keeping an eye on the situation since my first encounter with Karen. After scanning the documents I sent over, he let out a low whistle. "These are completely fabricated," he said. "The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over your land, and they know it. This is an intimidation tactic, nothing more. Can they actually enforce any of it?" I asked. "No," Jonathan said. "But that's not the point. The goal isn't to make you pay, it's to make you feel cornered. They want you to think it's easier to leave than to fight." I gritted my teeth. "Then let's fight." He chuckled. "That's what I like to hear. I'll draft a response, but you should prepare for them to escalate. People like Karen don't back down when they hit a wall. They just find another way to push." He wasn't wrong. Less than a week later, I received an official legal notice, this time, not from the HOA, but from a law firm. The words "cease and desist" glared at me from the header, followed by claims that my property was negatively impacting the community and that I was in violation of neighborhood preservation efforts. At the bottom, in bold, was the real kicker: failure to comply may result in legal action, including the forced sale of your property. I gripped the letter so hard my knuckles turned white. Karen had escalated to the final phase of her campaign. She wasn't just trying to fine me into submission, she was trying to take my land outright. Karen had made her move. She had turned my neighbors against me, tried to drown me in fake violations, and now she was going for the kill, an outright legal battle designed to push me out. She wanted me gone, and she wasn't even hiding it anymore. But I wasn't going anywhere. I wasted no time forwarding the cease and desist letter to Jonathan Blake. Within minutes of scanning it, he was already on the phone with me, irritation clear in his voice. "This is nothing more than legal intimidation," he said. They're banking on you panicking. They don't have the power to enforce any of this, but they're hoping you don't know that. They think I'll just pack up and leave, I muttered, pacing the cabin. Exactly, Jonathan said. And that's why we're going to hit back harder. We spent the next few days building a case. I compiled every piece of evidence I had, security footage of Karen trespassing, copies of her fraudulent violation notices, testimonies from the few neighbors still willing to speak against her. Marie even came forward, providing detailed accounts of Karen's manipulation tactics and history of harassment. But it wasn't enough to just defend myself. I needed to expose Karen for what she was. I started reaching out to other property owners, especially those who had been at the lake longer than I had. What I found was more damning than I expected. Karen had been pulling this stunt for years. She had pressured other residents into selling, using the same tactics: fake complaints, isolation, legal threats. Some had given in. Others had fought back, but few had the resources to take her on. I had the resources. I had the time. And I had nothing to lose. With Jonathan's help, I drafted my own legal response, not just a rebuttal to her claims, but a counterclaim accusing her of harassment, defamation, and illegal HOA overreach. We attached evidence of her trespassing, false accusations, and fabricated documents. I made sure every other homeowner at the lake got a copy of it. And then, for good measure, I took it one step further. I sent everything to the county office. Karen had operated in the shadows for too long. She had relied on people being too afraid or too tired to fight back. But now, she wasn't just dealing with someone she could scare into submission. She was dealing with me. The response was immediate. Within days, the county sent investigators to review the legitimacy of the HOA's actions. I heard through the grapevine that Karen was scrambling, calling emergency meetings, trying to control the narrative. But the cracks were forming. Then, something I didn't expect happened. One afternoon, I was outside stacking firewood when I heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I turned, half expecting to see Karen's SUV again, but instead, it was a different car. A man in a suit stepped out, adjusting his tie as he approached my porch. "Ethan Walker?" he asked, extending a business card. "My name is Richard Hale. I'm a state investigator looking into allegations of HOA misconduct in this area." I took the card, raising an eyebrow. "You don't say." "The county office flagged your complaint," he explained. "Turns out yours wasn't the only one. We've been reviewing similar reports from other homeowners. If you're willing, I'd like to take your statement." I didn't hesitate. I led him inside and laid everything out: the fake fines, the harassment, the fraudulent legal notices. Richard listened intently, taking notes, his expression growing more serious by the minute. By the time I finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "This is bad," he admitted. "HOAs get away with a lot, but this is blatant fraud. If half of what you're saying checks out, Karen and her HOA are in serious trouble." I felt a flicker of satisfaction. "What happens next?" I asked. Richard tucked his notepad away. "I'll be launching a full investigation. And if I were you, I'd be ready for Karen to lash out. She's about to realize she picked the wrong fight." That night, I sat on my porch, staring out at the still water. The lake, my land, my cabin, everything I had fought to protect. I wasn't naive enough to think this was over. Karen wouldn't go down quietly. But for the first time since this all started, I knew something she didn't. She wasn't the one in control anymore. The storm came faster than I expected. Less than a week after my meeting with the state investigator, Karen's world started to crack. The county had opened a formal case against her HOA, and word spread like wildfire. Homeowners who had once stayed silent were suddenly willing to talk. One by one, people came forward with their own horror stories, unlawful fines, forced property modifications, even threats of foreclosure against those who dared to challenge Karen's authority. The web of control she had spun for years was unraveling. Then came the final blow. A cease and desist order was issued, not to me, but to Karen and the HOA. The state found no legal standing for her claims against my property and ruled that she had abused her position to harass homeowners outside of her jurisdiction. The fraudulent fines, the fake legal threats, the fabricated violations, all of it was exposed. Karen had weaponized an HOA that had no real power, and now, she was facing real consequences. Her supporters turned on her first. When it became clear that Karen had lied, those who had once backed her quickly distanced themselves. The HOA held an emergency vote, and just like that, Karen was stripped of her position. A lawsuit followed, with multiple property owners, including me, filing claims against her for harassment and damages. I saw her one last time before she left. She was packing up her SUV, her face tight with anger, the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. She caught my eye as I stood on my porch, watching. For a moment, I thought she might say something. But then, with one last glare, she climbed into her car, slammed the door, and sped down the driveway. I exhaled, finally letting go of the tension that had gripped me for months. For the first time in a long time, the lake was quiet. The water lapped against the shore, the wind whispered through the trees, and the solitude I had fought so hard to protect was mine again. The battle had been long, exhausting, and at times, infuriating. But in the end, I had won. Not just against Karen, but against the idea that people like her could take whatever they wanted just because they thought they could. I sat on my porch as the sun dipped below the trees, savoring the peace. Then, a thought crossed my mind. How many others had been through the same thing? How many people had been bullied, manipulated, or pushed out of their own homes by someone like Karen? Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.